and excitement of Nintendo right in the palm of your hand. Introducing Game Boy. They said it wasn't humanly possible.
Who can forget handheld gaming, the staple of on-the-go gaming? Handhelds have been around nearly as long as household gaming has been, and in recent years, consoles like the Nintendo Switch have sold millions of copies, breaking records and climbing the best-selling charts. But that begs the question, where did handheld gaming even begin? And to answer that question, we'll have to take it all the way back to 1989 to Nintendo's Game Boy. During the 80s, arcades and gaming in general were huge, and because of this, the Game Boy was a huge hit, as it was the first ever handheld console to be released. Well, technically not, as the Parker brothers, who are the creators of many famous board games such as Monopoly and Clue, released the Merlin. And the Merlin itself was a small handheld released in 1978, which resembled that of an old school telephone. Now, it only had 4 games, but for its time, it was truly groundbreaking. You see, at the time, the furthest you got with handheld games was 1 game in an individual machine, like the Game & Watch. But the Merlin? It had 4 games, and while that may not seem like a lot, it's still more extensive than the current PS Plus library. But anyways, back to the Game Boy. So, Nintendo released the NES 6 years prior to the release of the Game Boy, and it was a huge hit. Nearly 35 years later, it has sold nearly 62 million units. And because of this, Nintendo knew that whatever the successor to the NES was, it had to be an even bigger hit. At this time, Nintendo already had some experiences in the handheld gaming department, with the Game & Watch, as I mentioned earlier. Now, the Game & Watches themselves were essentially mini consoles that came with 1 game, usually with very simple coding. And, you know, at the time it was cool and all, but it certainly isn't anything special for today's standards. So, you know, you'd figure that with Nintendo's past experiences, the Game Boy would be good, right? I mean, yeah, it's Nintendo, but the Game Boy itself was a hit, as it sold 118 million copies, nearly double that of the NES. Seeing the success of the Game Boy, many other companies jumped on the bandwagon. The Atari Lynx, the Game Gear, the Turbo Express, all big names from big companies, but the success just couldn't match that of the Game Boy, as the Lynx, Game Gear, and Turbo Express collectively only sold around 14 million copies. Nintendo had clearly taken control of the handheld market, and they came there to stay, as they capitalized off their success. And in 1998, they released the Game Boy Color, which was even more revolutionary than the last. The Game Boy Color was the Game Boy, but with a colored screen. Truly revolutionary. Just 3 years later though, the Game Boy got its biggest update yet, with the Game Boy Advance. The Advance was compatible with a variety of systems, and 2 years later in 2003, the Game Boy Advance SP released. And if all of this wasn't confusing enough, you also had the Game Boy Micro, the Game Boy Camera, the Game Boy Player, the Super Game Boy, the Game Boy e-reader, the Game Boy Cable Link, and oh my god, there's so many. How many versions of this thing do you need? Jeez, dude. I think I've said game like 32 times as of reading this. Jesus. Okay, enough about the Game Boy. Let's fast forward a few years. Now, by this time, Nintendo had released the GameCube and was on top of it all. The Game Boy Original and Color had sold over 110 million copies, with the Advance selling 81.5 million too. And to add on to everything else, Nintendo had zero competition. The WonderSwan and N-Gage had only sold around 3 million units apiece. And to put that in perspective, on its release, the Game Boy sold about 300,000 units in its first 2 weeks. This reign of pure domination on the handheld market wouldn't last forever though, as at E3 2003, Sony would announce the PlayStation Portable, or the PSP for short. The PSP would release in 2004 in Japan, and a year later in America, and it was a pretty big deal for PlayStation at the time, as they were the first real competitors to Nintendo in the handheld department. Now, the PSP itself ended up selling about 81 million units, which, to put in perspective, is more than the Atari Lynx, Turbo Express, Game Gear, Nomad, Wonderslot, and Engage combined. And get this, 3 times over. Those consoles combined only sold about 22 million copies. Anyways though, the PSP later had its own Game Boy Micro with the PSP Slim, because what's a handheld if there's not a tinier version? And what's a handheld without more versions later on? Because we don't want to forget the PSP Go or the PSP Street. And Nintendo saw this and thought to themselves, yeah, nah, this is our market. And with that, we got the Nintendo DS. The Nintendo DS is actually pretty revolutionary. It had a touchscreen, a microphone, and wireless connection. All of these would be key assets, as plenty of new games would utilize these new features, like Nintendogs or Ace Attorney with the touchpad. Most importantly though, was backwards compatibility. Now, while this wasn't the first case of backwards compatibility in gaming, it was definitely very convenient, because if you bought a DS and you didn't want to lose your Game Boy games, you could still use them on the DS, which was pretty cool, and even looking back, it's still awesome you can do that. The DS was a huge hit, and they mostly worked on it for the next few years, but in 2010, Nintendo would make their next big move. You see, after a 4-year hiatus, at E3 2010, Nintendo would announce the Nintendo 3DS, which was around the same time PlayStation was making all their moves with the PSP's post-launch releases. The 3DS was about what you'd expect. It was a Nintendo DS but in 3D. You were able to see images in 3D, and you could turn the setting off at any time. Now, while it wasn't the biggest deal ever, it was still pretty cool for the time, and this was Nintendo's first attempt at 3D since the Virtual Boy, which was a flop. But the 3DS was definitely a large improvement. And what you figured would have preceded the 3DS came 2 years later in the 2DS. Now, the 2DS was easily the weakest straw for Nintendo in the DS series, and probably for good reason. It wasn't clamshell like the DS and 3DS, and the battery life was pretty trash. It was relatively cheap though, launching at only $129. And I waited talking about the 2DS to bring up all the extra editions of the DS's, and you had the 3DS XL, the LL, and of course the 2DS XL. But, it's still not as bad as the Game Boy. Now, I wanted to take a detour from the history and take a moment to just fuel up in some nostalgia, as I grew up having a 3DS XL, and let me just say, I absolutely love that thing. I remember getting it for Christmas in like 2014 with Super Smash Bros, and it was just so fun. I remember just how awesome it was that I could take this little device with me anywhere I went, and I'd take pictures and play games, and it was just awesome. And outside of having a lot of features, the games on the 3DS were really fun. Animal Crossing New Leaf, Mario Kart 7, New Super Mario Bros. 3D Land, and so many other great titles. And I think the games held well for themselves. And to be honest, they all played really well. And looking back, they still impress me even to this day. The games themselves played really well, and as a kid, you weren't focused on the bad parts. But looking back, some of the titles really hold a name for themselves. So I just wanted to talk about my experience. I'm sure that now my Animal Crossing town is fully overgrown with weeds, but if I ever were to return, you bet I will pull each and every one of them up. Now, obviously I'm a bit pushed by nostalgia, as I grew up on this little console or handheld, whatever you want to call it, but I don't really care, man. I really love this thing, and so did other people. And to be honest, it makes sense why. This thing was great. And the people proved it, as if you take the sales of every single DS variant, the amount of units sold is over 200 million, and that is 3 times what the PSP sold, which is just insanity. Speaking of the PSP though, let's get back to PlayStation. Around this same time, PlayStation released the PS Vita in 2012. Now, the PS Vita was the primary competitor to the 3DS, but it never really captured the same success that the 3DS had, as it had a slow selling start, and never really came close to the success that the PSP had either, and ultimately it ended up selling about 6 million units. The PSP, PS Vita, and the DS line were the only real handheld consoles during the mid-2000s and early 2010s. But I do want to give a real quick shout out to the Wii U gamepad, as it's not really a handheld, but it's close enough, man. You can't really take it anywhere like the other ones, but it's still pretty close with its controller having a screen. And honestly, I was a big fan of the Wii U growing up, so I just wanted to briefly mention it, even though it's not really a handheld. But you know what, man? Shout out to the Wii U. Five years after the release of the 2DS, Nintendo decided to enter its next era of handhelds, and they released the Nintendo Switch. The Switch has arguably Nintendo's most iconic feature on one of their handhelds since the DS's touchpad, with that being the Joy-Cons. The Joy-Cons are the controller for the Switch, but they can be either attached to the screen or removed, and this is one of the best parts considering if you find the placement to be uncomfortable. You can always put it into a controller. And at the time of this recording, the Nintendo Switch has sold about 132 million units, putting it third ever right under the Nintendo DS and PS2. You'd think that with these massive sales that the Switch is amazing and one of the best consoles out right now. Well, it may be a hot take, but I think the Switch is actually one of, if not the worst, mainstream console out right now. I mean, in a world with the PS5, Xbox Series S and X, mobile, and PC gaming, handheld gaming just doesn't hit anymore. And it doesn't help that the Switch isn't making any cases for itself. Super Mario Odyssey was the first 3D Mario game to be released for the Switch. And don't get me wrong, it's a good game, but a game that's over 8 years old shouldn't still be $60 on the Nintendo eShop. All of the games are overpriced, and you can always go to a pawn shop or a bargain store in hopes of finding one. But what's to do if you were gifted a Nintendo eShop gift card? I mean, even a $100 gift card won't get you anything but one mainline game from Mario, Zelda, or Pokemon. It's just ridiculous. And Nintendo tries to make up for it by selling console bundles that include a game. Technically, they include 3 actually, but you can only select one to actually download. Like, why not just give me all of these old games that are 5+ years old, like Mario Kart 8, Mario Odyssey, and New Super Mario Bros. U all in one? Now, before I rant about the issues me and many other people have with the Switch, I want to talk about the Switch itself because I actually got one back in 2017, and honestly at the time I was pretty pleased with the thing. Although I didn't really play it all that much because I had my Wii U and my PlayStation 4, but I will say it was solid at the time. I remember playing Smash Bros. And Mario Kart a lot, and man, they were pretty good. The only issue I had with the console is that the controller I had stick drift after a while, and honestly the games felt a bit boring after a while. But besides that, it was a pretty solid experience. Now, I did quit playing my Switch around 2021, and honestly I was past this as I was preparing to get a PS5 and looking forward to the next generation of consoles. And I get that the Switch was disappointing, but I don't hate it entirely. But let's get into why I have some issues with it and why other people absolutely despise this console. First off, the amount of space you get on these things are just horrible. The base Nintendo Switch comes with 32 gigabytes of space, and some great games like Tears of Kingdom are 16 gigabytes. That's literally half your storage in one game. And some games like NBA 2K are even more than just the standard at 55 gigabytes. I mean, in fairness, you could ask, who buys a Switch to play 2K? But still, one game? I mean, imagine being a kid getting a Switch for Christmas and you can't play the game you got because your mom didn't buy a better SD card. The Switch's charging just sucks. I mean, it can take hours just to charge the thing all the way up, and then it'll drain your battery in an hour and a half. All of that just so huge games like Fortnite can look like Play-Doh the video game. And to top everything off, the Switch has no major competitors. And you may be asking, well, what about the Steam Deck, which is relatively new? But for $500, you can get a good enough PC to play most of the games on the Steam Deck on Steam. And because of its price, I don't think it'll ever come close to the Switch's sales. And additionally, the online service is just horrible. It's so bad that I could make a video talking about it in its own right, but all you really need to know for this one is that it's bad. But to wrap things up on the Switch, I don't think that because of the flaws that handhelds are completely ruined. Nor do I think that the Switch is entirely bad. It's definitely got some bang for its buck at times, but honestly, handheld gaming just doesn't have the same aura that it once did. The DS's small features like a camera and a drawing pad set it apart and made it something special. And I don't really think the Switch has anything making it special anymore. I mean, it was so great on launch because of the Joy-Cons, and nearly 8 years later, it's not exciting anymore. And in my opinion, this may be a sign for Nintendo to move on to the next console to save handheld gaming. Now, I know they just announced the Nintendo Switch 2, which will be coming down the line, and maybe I'll talk about it one day, give my thoughts on it, and hopefully it'll be better than the current state of the Nintendo Switch. But until then, though, handhelds aren't going to change. Well, at least until the PSP2 or the Wii phone comes out. But that's all for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this very different video. You know, it's something that I've been wanting to expand on for a while. Just do other things that's not Total Drama related. And I mean, because of this, the next video is going to be the Q&A, and it'll also mark my first whole year on YouTube, which is just great. It's a crazy feat, man. I didn't know I'd ever like make it that far. Just from making videos, talking about shows and whatnot, and you know, to see the progression is just great, and I'm thankful for all of you guys for supporting me, and I hope you guys just continue to do so, and I'm gonna keep making bangers for you guys. I've been excited and I've been consistent for once, which is nice to see, so I'm gonna keep grinding and doing my best. But that's pretty much all I have for this one. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next one. Take it easy. Peace.
They said it wasn't humanly possible.